this was a government-funded initiative. It was supported by the taxpayer, and as we know, the British Hindus are very much prominent contributors to the exchequer. So it just beggars belief that in the 21st century, they would still be doing the same sort of nonsense that they were doing in the 1800s. In fact, when I got to grips with what they were trying to do, it reminded me again of what William Wilberforce did in 1813, when the Church of England and the evangelical vultures were trying to get into India, were trying to get hold of assets, get hold of land, and start to exert their influence there. At that time, an exercise was embarked upon with exactly the same motive and exactly the same method of execution. The motive was to gain access to India. The manner of execution was to spread vilification in every church against Hindus. To deliberately create an air of anti-Hinduism was the church's policy.
Is Vishal Arora a Hindu? Because the name is certainly implying that he is.
Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised whether further research will establish this conclusively, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if his allegiance lay with the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church, and that he turns out to be a convert. It's quite remarkable when you study some of our Indian origin commentators, shall we say, the way they adopt the mannerisms of Western reporters. In fact, I was watching him and I thought, hang on a moment, that's a Robert Peston lookalike. The mannerisms are exactly the same, the programming is exactly the same, the conditioning is exactly the same, the value system is exactly the same. And it's a tragedy that there seems to be no sign of allegiance to the civilization to which they have always belonged.
Jai Shri Krishna, Namaste, and welcome to Citti Media's Current Affairs Show. Today we're going to be discussing the post-conference FoRB's event that happened in London a couple of weeks ago. We've actually been watching some of the clips from that particular conference. We've got one attached for you to watch shortly, and to discuss that further, we have our esteemed guest, Pandit Satish Sharma. Panditji, welcome.
Pranam Sloniji, Namaste, Jai Shri Ram to you. I'm delighted to talk on this subject. It's going to provide fuel for many conversations, and it would be really wonderful to share that video that you've just referred to with the audience, so they too can start to explore and understand what's really going on, what the motives perhaps behind the scenes are. So please, yes, let's go ahead and do play that video.
I'm going to turn over to you, Vishal, because you've got a real experience of what's been going on in India. So please tell us.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, what I have to say is a paradox. You know, on the one hand, we see that India's ranking fell to 150 out of 180 countries in the 2022 World Press Freedom Index. And just recently, before I left India, 2 people were arrested by the government. One is a social activist whose name is Teesta Setalwad, and who draws attention to religion-based violence in India. And a fact checker, Mohammad Zubair, who also has similar work. And last year, 2021, was the most violent year for India's Christian minority, because 486 incidents of violence were reported. And this year, thus far, more than 220 incidents have already happened. And then dozens of Muslims were killed last year in incidents of communal violence and also lynchings that took place. And there is a great deal of repression in the country. The space for dissent has shrunk. All of that is true. However, I would say that it's easy for journalists to cover FoRB issues. In fact, I would like to say that the main issues that you find in the media in India have a lot to do with freedom of religion or belief. If we look at three main themes, most of the stories that you would read or watch or listen to in the Indian media, you would find that they belong to one of the three themes. One is, are Muslims anti-national or terrorists? Somehow alluding to this question, news stories are. And then second is, are Christians converting Hindus by offering money or forcibly? And third is the civil society anti-national? Because it comprises leftists, quote-unquote Maoists, extreme communists, Muslims, and Christians. And out of these themes, two narratives emerge. One is that Muslims, Christians, and people in the civil society are anti-national. And the second theme is that they are being, second narrative is that they are being politically targeted, in India. And it depends on which newspaper or which news channel it is. You can expect what narrative they would be using. The press in India is divided. We have left-leaning newspapers and media organizations, and then we have right-leaning media organizations. And we can know what to expect. However, I would say whatever you talk about when it comes to FoRB, it benefits the government, especially the BJP, which is the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a Hindu nationalist party. Because, in fact, the government wants such issues to be in the press, because if these emotive issues are not the focus of the media and journalists, then the media would start looking at governance, economy, inflation, joblessness, and some other blunders that governments make. So what the governments do not want is that media and people have the time and resources to actually scrutinize the government in terms of how they are doing their job, which is a primary job to provide essential services to people. So, which is why you would see that around the election, the violence against minorities increase, because they don't want people or the media to look at governance record of the government. So I would say that we may pat our own backs for courageously, reporting on these issues, but we are being co-opted and we are being outwitted by the government.
Oh, that's really interesting. Really interesting, the idea that somehow dividing the nation and creating, if you like, culture wars is a way of distracting from the feebleness of government, who should be held to account for their failures around economic matters and around their own failures as governors. Anyway, that is really interesting.
So now we've all seen the video. Who on earth is this Vishal Arora to have such a voice on such a platform? Who is he?
So wasn't it a horrific experience watching this video? And please bear in mind that this event happened only 2 or 3 days after the beheading of Kanhaiya Lalji, and after that sequence of terrible events orchestrated against Nupur Sharma. And so there is a lot happening in Bharat, and yet when it comes to a person who is on the ground, who is bringing the real news of what's really happening in India, there's no mention of anything to do with attacks on Hindus. And so it is worth, your question is pertinent, it is worth having a look at who Vishal Arora is. And so if you do a little bit of searching, it's not too difficult to understand why it was that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office invited him to speak on this conference floor. But there were a couple of things that really struck me as odd. Vishal Arora's contribution is so clearly a scripted contribution. It's cherry-picking of the nth degree. It is supporting a narrative without looking at any comparatives or without trying to introduce balance. The narrative that it seems to be wanting to press is this: Hindus are in the majority, Hindus are savage, the minorities are weak, vulnerable, delightful people, oppressed and targeted by this majoritarian Hindu state. And I use the word majoritarian because whenever they don't want to say the word Hindu, they always say the majority. Okay, it's a coded way of dealing with this. Everybody knows that the majority is Hindu. And so if you were to use the word Hindu, then they'd be accused of, shall we say, defaming the whole community. So they're very careful. But they're quite okay to use the word majoritarian, which achieves the same thing without actually stepping into that quagmire. So here's the narrative that is obviously being built up. The narrative is that all of the religious minorities, and remember, it's the religious minorities he speaks about,
Yes.
and
Yes.
they are oppressed by a religious majority. That's crystal clear. Vishal Arora is a journalist, and on his bio, we see that he has written for such disreputable rags such as The Caravan and publications who we know receive funding from anti-India, anti-Hindu forces. But what's really surprising for me, and we're going to find out a little bit more, is why the Foreign and Commonwealth Office chose him. He's very clearly pro the evangelical Christianized messaging that ran through the whole of the FoRB. Why on earth did they choose him? There are so many voices who are pro-India, who could talk about the incredible strides forward, the changes being made to the religious landscape that the Modi government has introduced, the equality dimension, a triple talaq, so many changes, that the whole of what happened in Kashmir introduced dramatic equality, and yet none of it is spoken about. What we're given is a little schedule of cherry-picked crimes, and all crimes are reprehensible, but to cherry-pick only those which highlight victimhood for the minorities and which emphasize the savage nature of the majority Hindu is an act of deceit. So we will be asking questions of the FCO and also Fiona Bruce and her FoRB APPG as to what was it that drove them to present such an anti-Hindu, anti-India picture.
Yes, yes, because we saw in the video clip just now how he highlights the 486 deaths of the Christians, of the dozens of Muslim deaths. But where was the Hindu statistic? And we have to keep in mind these are
Absolutely.
from a population of 1.2 billion, and as you say, Kanhaiya Lalji was just killed 2 or 3 days before this was actually recorded. So where were the Hindu statistics? Why is there no voice for Hindus on these platforms? That is something that really needs to be addressed. And unless Hindus start rattling cages, nothing will change.
Solanji, I think it's worth emphasizing that this was a government-funded initiative. It was supported by the taxpayer, and as we know, the British Hindus are very much prominent contributors to the exchequer. So it just beggars belief that in the 21st century, they would still be doing the same sort of nonsense that they were doing in the 1800s. In fact, when I got to grips with what they were trying to do, it reminded me again of what William Wilberforce did in 1813, when the Church of England and the evangelical vultures were trying to get into India, were trying to get hold of assets, get hold of land, and start to exert their influence there. At that time, an exercise was embarked upon with exactly the same motive and exactly the same method of execution. The motive was to gain access to India. The manner of execution was to spread vilification in every church against Hindus. To deliberately create an air of anti-Hinduism was the church's policy, and it was doing it from every single pulpit. And as I mentioned, I think in one of our earlier talks, 500,000 plus devout Anglican Christians signed petitions appealing to Parliament saying, please, please, let us go over to India as white saviors, as Christian saviors, and let us save those terrible, let us save those natives, those humble natives from those terrible Hindus. And this FoRB conference is merely the 21st century version of exactly that same motive. It's surprising and disappointing that they would do this and do it so blatantly. And I think this does need a response. You're absolutely right. It needs a response from our organizations. It needs certainly a response from our parliamentarians who occasionally say that they speak for British Hindus.
Yes, yes, no, absolutely. I also noticed in the video, Vishal Arora believed that all of this was a tactic from the BJP as a diversion to take away any scrutiny from their ruling. What government would create such division in their own country just so they didn't have to answer about economics and education and the regular things a government is expected to do? The narrative is absolutely slanderous. Actually, it's very slanderous. So what I've realized is that since Modi ji has come into power, I'm going to bring in the BBC as well. We can all tell now that the BBC is anti-Hindu, anti-India. They have been for many years, but it seems to be up a gear since Modi ji, because Modi ji is the only person that has come to India and finally taken away colonization. And I feel this is why India is under, and his government, not just his government, it's the people's government. It's the largest democratic victory in history in the globe. Yet they are being demonized over and over. What is your take on this?
Sonaji, there are two very important points that you raised there. One is Bharat is a democracy, and the will of the people, the indigenous people of that land, surely should be respected by countries who preach the wonderful way of governance that democracy is. But in many cases, these religious institutions, these theocracies, they conveniently ignore that fact and take the moral high ground and seek to intervene in the democratic wishes of a nation. Now, philosophically, this is exactly the same as that psychosis which says that I know what's good for you better than you know what's good for you. And I take for myself the right to be able to create an environment where my wishes about your future should be brought into reality. And that's colonialism. That's exactly what the white slave masters were doing in South Africa for so long. It's still that same sentiment of supremacy, superiority, of saviorness. It's just an arrogance which doesn't have any place in the 21st century. And so it is. You're absolutely right. It's that same sentiment. They ignore democracy when it suits them to. Now, the second point that you raised, you're right about the BBC too. And in fact, we should have a more detailed conversation about the BBC in future talks. But the BBC it operates in exactly the same way as we have just seen this panel operate. For example, when Vishal made those observations about the BJP and about the government actually causing rifts, an independent moderator would have said, "Do you have any evidence for that?" And that would have been an end to that conversation. And when you look at the credentials of the moderator, Helena Kennedy, she is a QC, accustomed to working on the basis of evidence. And those two dimensions for me were just horrific. Why on earth was there not balance on the panel? Why did she not interrogate him for supporting evidence for the claims that he was making? And because she did neither of those, we have no other option but to assume that she was actually complicit in this attempt to vilify and defame the governing bodies of the largest democracy in the world. And the arrogance which says, yes, we can do that, that is very traditionally associated with the evangelical operatives.
Yes, no, that's interesting that she's a QC, because there was literally no cross-examination whatsoever. Every word was taken as real.
Well, you could say that every word was taken as gospel.
As gospel. Thank you. Yes, precisely that. Speaking of which, is Vishal Arora a Hindu? Because the name is certainly implying that he is.
Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised whether further research will establish this conclusively, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if his allegiance lay with the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church, and that he turns out to be a convert. It's quite remarkable when you study some of our Indian origin commentators, shall we say, the way they adopt the mannerisms of Western reporters. In fact, I was watching him and I thought, hang on a moment, that's a Robert Peston lookalike. The mannerisms are exactly the same, the programming is exactly the same, the conditioning is exactly the same, the value system is exactly the same. And it's a tragedy that there seems to be no sign of allegiance to the civilization to which they have always belonged. And that is what I find to be the saddest development, that it's possible for a human being to be separated, to have his connection with his roots slashed so that they become nothing other than civilizational flotsam and jetsam, ready to be carried away on the tide of whoever manages to deposit some alluring temptations, or who actually openly says, right, we will pay you for taking this particular position. So it was disappointing to see him behave in that manner. But as I said, the larger responsibility is with the organizers of FoRB. My understanding is that attempts were made to ensure a balanced presentation, but those attempts were not successful. So there are many more questions to be asked, and hopefully we will get some answers from them.
Yes. On a final note, actually, touching on what you've just said, it does seem that a lot of converted people have completely been disconnected from their roots by following the religion of the invaders, be it the Mughal invaders, be it the British invaders. They have completely slashed from their roots. Now, Vishal actually raised that and said that the BJP are calling these people anti-national. Now, these people are coming across as anti-national, so it's not the government. Anyone viewing the views from the people that have converted away from their heritage are talking against India, be it the democracy, be it the people, be it the majority, be it the history, be it the heritage. What is precisely going on in the psyche of someone that's converted?
It's noticeable now because it's increasing. There was a time when the hand of the church was hidden, and in the Northeast, for example, there has been violence precipitated by members of the Indian community who have converted to Christianity. In addition to that, we have seen in the past, in fact, very recently, one of the parliamentarians actually said that in order to defeat the BJP in this state, we have to convert even more people to Christianity. It was a statement that was made as overtly as that. And so the church cannot claim that its hands are clean. It cannot say that we don't engage in politics when openly it does. And when the politics are acting to erase indigenous civilizational memory, it is anti-national, but worse than that, it's also contrary to the United Nations charters. The United Nations charters place the responsibility on its member governments to protect and promote and nurture the indigenous traditions, religions, knowledge systems, and everything else. So their allegation that this is a BJP concocted scheme, that branding them anti-nationals is a political move, is actually not true. It would seem to be based on fact, and as the good book says, you shall know them by their actions.
Yes. Panditji, thank you so much for your insight with this recent clip, and I'm sure there'll be many more to come as we decipher and go through the post-mortem of this conference that happened recently. Thank you again for today, and I look forward to our next talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saloniji, and Jai Shri Ram.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.